The biting winter wind whipped through the streets of Manhattan, sending newspapers and debris scattering across the sidewalks. Among the rushing crowds and yellow cabs, a young woman named Alexandra huddled in the doorway of a closed boutique, clutching her thin jacket closer to her body. At 23, she had already experienced more hardship than most people face in a lifetime. Despite her circumstances, Alexandra's warm brown eyes held a determined spark. Each morning, she would carefully wash her face in the public bathroom of a nearby coffee shop, arrange her curly hair as neatly as possible, and head to the local library where she spent hours applying for jobs and reading books on business and entrepreneurship. On this particular morning, as she made her way through the busy streets, she noticed something unusual. A well-dressed older man was struggling to cross the street, his movements unsteady. While others rushed past, Alexandra noticed his disorientation and the way he clutched his chest. Without hesitation, she rushed to his side. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, supporting his arm. The man's face was pale, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the cold. I think I need help," he managed to say, his breathing labored. Alexandra quickly guided him to a nearby bench and pulled out her old phone, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said firmly, already dialing 911. As they waited, she kept talking to him, making sure he stayed conscious. She learned his name was Richard Thompson, CEO of Thompson Industries, though she had never heard of the company. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and Alexandra insisted on accompanying Richard to the hospital. Something in her gut told her she couldn't leave this stranger alone. In the emergency room, she provided what information she could to the medical staff and waited patiently in the corridor. Hours later, a doctor emerged to inform her that Mr. Thompson had suffered a minor heart attack, but thanks to her quick action, they had been able to treat him in time. The doctor asked if she was family. "No," Alexandra replied softly. "I just couldn't walk away when someone needed help." Later that evening, as she prepared to leave, Richard called her into his private room. He had regained some color, and his steel-gray eyes studied her with curiosity. "You saved my life today," he said simply. "Most people would have walked past. Why didn't you?" Alexandra shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "My mother always taught me that we have a responsibility to help others, no matter our own circumstances." She didn't mention that her mother had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her alone in the world. Richard noticed her worn clothes and the way she carefully held herself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. "Do you have somewhere to be?" he asked. Alexandra hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Not really, sir. I've been between homes for a while now." Richard's expression softened. "Then let me help you, as you've helped me. I own several hotels in the city. Let me arrange a room for you, at least for a few nights." Alexandra's first instinct was to refuse, but the thought of another night in the bitter cold made her reconsider. "That's very kind of you, sir." As Richard made the arrangements, neither of them could have known that this chance encounter would unravel a mystery that had haunted him for over 2 decades. He couldn't explain why, but something about Alexandra's gentle demeanor and the familiar warmth in her eyes stirred long-buried memories. The next morning, Alexandra woke up in a warm bed for the first time in months. The hotel room was modest but comfortable, and she spent several minutes just enjoying the luxury of a hot shower. When she emerged, she found a message from Richard's assistant, inviting her to breakfast at the hospital. During their meal, Richard learned more about Alexandra's story. She had grown up in foster care after her mother's death, bouncing between homes until she aged out of the system. Despite the challenges, she had managed to graduate high school and even complete some community college courses before financial hardship forced her to stop. "What do you remember about your mother?" Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral. Alexandra's eyes softened. "She was the kindest person I've ever known. She worked as a nurse, always taking extra shifts to make sure I had everything I needed. But she never talked about my father or her life before I was born." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. The timeline matched. The profession matched. Could it be possible? As they continued talking, Richard noticed more similarities. The way Alexandra's nose crinkled when she smiled, just like his late wife's, the determined set of her jaw that he saw every morning in his own mirror, and most strikingly, the heart-shaped birthmark on her wrist that was identical to the one his lost daughter had. 23 years ago, Richard's wife had disappeared with their infant daughter during a period of marital tension. Despite hiring private investigators and searching tirelessly, he had never found them. His wife had changed their names, started a new life, and eventually passed away without ever reaching out to him. But here, through an incredible twist of fate, his daughter had found him, not knowing who he was, but simply by following her inherent kindness, the same quality that had made him fall in love with her mother all those years ago. Richard knew he needed to proceed carefully. The revelation would be shocking for Alexandra, and he wanted to be absolutely certain before saying anything. He arranged for a private investigator to discreetly verify the connection while continuing to help Alexandra get back on her feet. He offered her a job at Thompson Industries, starting in the mailroom but with opportunities for advancement. Alexandra threw herself into the work with dedication, quickly impressing her supervisors with her intelligence and work ethic. Over the next few weeks, Richard watched from a distance as his daughter found her footing in the corporate world. Each small success made his heart swell with pride, even as he struggled with the weight of his secret. The DNA test results were due any day now, and Richard found himself both eagerly awaiting and dreading the moment of truth. One evening, as Alexandra was leaving work, Richard invited her to his office. The manila envelope containing the test results sat heavy on his desk. As she settled into the chair across from him, Richard took a deep breath, preparing to share the truth that would change both their lives forever. Alexandra noticed the tension in Richard's posture as she sat down in his office. The evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the luxurious space. She had grown comfortable around him over the past few weeks, but something about his expression made her nervous. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, smoothing her newly purchased business skirt, a far cry from the worn clothes she'd worn when they first met. Richard picked up the manila envelope with slightly trembling hands. "Alexandra, what I'm about to tell you might come as a shock. I want you to know that you can take all the time you need to process this information." He pulled out several documents, including an old photograph that made Alexandra's heart stop. It showed a woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling at the camera while holding a baby. That's my mother," she whispered, reaching for the photo. "Yes," Richard said softly. "Her name was Grace Chen before she changed it to Grace Walker. She was my wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Alexandra stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "What are you saying?" Richard spread out more documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and finally, the DNA test results that had arrived that morning. 23 years ago, I lost my wife and baby daughter during a difficult time in our marriage. Grace took our daughter and disappeared. I searched for years, but she had changed both their names and started a new life. Alexandra's hands shook as she looked at the papers. The DNA results were conclusive, a 99.9% match. Richard Thompson was her father. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did she leave?" Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I was different then. Consumed by work, barely home, thinking I was doing the right thing by providing financially while missing the most important things in life. Grace tried to tell me, but I wouldn't listen. When she left, it broke me. I realized too late what I had lost." Alexandra stood up abruptly, needing space to breathe. The room felt too small, the reality too overwhelming. I need time," she said, backing toward the door. "Of course," Richard replied, fighting the urge to reach out to her. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." She fled the office, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the physical exertion to ground herself. Her entire world had just shifted, and she didn't know how to process it. The father she had wondered about her entire life had been right in front of her for weeks. That night, Alexandra barely slept in her hotel room. She pulled out the small box of mementos she had managed to keep through her years of homelessness, photos of her mother, a few childhood drawings, and her mother's old diary that she had never had the heart to read. With trembling fingers, she opened the diary for the first time. Her mother's elegant handwriting filled the pages, and as Alexandra read, she began to understand the full story. Grace had written about her deep love for Richard, their whirlwind romance, and their early marriage. She described her joy at becoming pregnant, and her growing despair as Richard became more distant, working longer hours and missing important moments. The final entries revealed her fear that their daughter would grow up feeling as lonely and unloved as she did. "I know leaving will hurt him," Grace had written, "but I have to protect our daughter. Maybe someday he'll understand that love isn't about providing things, it's about being present." Alexandra wept as she read, understanding both her mother's pain and her father's regret. The next morning, she called in sick to work, needing more time to process everything. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. No pressure." The simple message touched something in her heart. This man, who had lost everything because of his past mistakes, had spent decades searching for them. And when fate had finally brought them together, he had helped her without even knowing who she was. After 3 days of soul-searching, Alexandra returned to Thompson Industries. She rode the elevator to the top floor, her heart pounding but her mind clear. When she entered Richard's office, he was on the phone but immediately ended the call. "I read Mom's diary," she said without preamble. "I understand why she left, and I understand why you've changed." Richard nodded, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I've spent 23 years regretting my choices and trying to become a better man. Meeting you, seeing your kindness and strength despite everything you've been through, I'm so proud to be your father, Alexandra. Even if you're not ready to accept me as such." Alexandra took a deep breath. "I have questions. Lots of them. And this won't be easy, we have 23 years to make up for. But I'd like to try." For the first time since she'd known him, Richard Thompson broke down in tears. Alexandra found herself moving forward, her own eyes wet, and then they were hugging, father and daughter reunited by a twist of fate and an act of kindness. Over the next few weeks, they began the delicate process of building a relationship. Richard shared stories about Grace from their early days, her passion for nursing, her contagious laugh, her love of early morning walks. Alexandra told him about growing up, the struggles and triumphs, and the ways her mother had shaped her into the person she was today. Richard insisted on Alexandra moving into a proper apartment, but she was determined to earn her own way. They compromised. He would help with the deposit, but she would pay the rent from her salary. She continued working in the mailroom, wanting to prove herself on her own merits rather than taking advantage of her newfound connection to the CEO. One evening, as they shared dinner in Richard's penthouse apartment, Alexandra noticed him watching her with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked. "You remind me so much of your mother," he said softly. "But you're also your own person, stronger than either of us ever was. I know Grace would be proud of who you've become. I know I am." As the city lights twinkled below them, Alexandra realized that while she couldn't change the past, the future held possibilities she had never dreamed of. Her mother had always told her that every ending was just a new beginning in disguise. Now, sitting across from her father, Alexandra understood exactly what she had meant. The news spread through Thompson Industries like wildfire. The CEO's long-lost daughter had been found, and she had been working in their mailroom. Alexandra tried to keep her head down and continue her work as usual, but she could feel the stares and whispers following her through the corridors. "Did you hear? She was homeless when they met. I heard she saved his life. How do we know she's really his daughter?" The worst came one morning when Alexandra overheard two executives talking in the break room. "It's obviously a scam," one of them said. "Some street-smart girl taking advantage of a lonely old man. I bet she orchestrated the whole thing." Alexandra's hands tightened around her coffee cup, but she held her tongue. She had faced worse in her life, and she wouldn't let office gossip break her spirit. Still, the words stung more than she wanted to admit. That evening, during their weekly dinner, Richard noticed her unusual quietness. "What's bothering you, sweetheart?" he asked, using the term of endearment that still felt new and precious to both of them. Alexandra pushed her food around her plate. "Maybe I should quit," she said finally. "Find a job somewhere else where nobody knows who I am." Richard's fork clattered against his plate. "Is someone giving you trouble?" "It's not that simple," she sighed. "People think I'm using you, that this is all some elaborate con. And honestly, can you blame them?" "It does sound unbelievable. Homeless girl saves billionaire who turns out to be her long-lost father. It's like something out of a movie." Richard was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and walked to his study. He returned with a small, worn leather box. "I've been waiting for the right time to show you this," he said, opening it carefully. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, private investigator reports, and letters, all dating back over 2 decades. Each piece documented Richard's search for his wife and daughter. The latest ones were from just months before they met. "I never stopped looking for you," he said softly. "Not for a single day. Anyone who doubts our story can look at these and see 23 years of proof." Alexandra touched the papers gently, reading headlines that spelled out her father's dedication. Thompson Industries CEO increases reward for information. Billionaire's search for family continues after 15 years. Richard Thompson establishes foundation for missing children. "Why didn't you show me these before?" she asked. "I didn't want you to feel pressured by the weight of my search," he explained. "You needed time to accept this in your own way, not because of what I'd been doing all these years." The next day, Alexandra walked into Thompson Industries with her head held high. She had earned her place there, first through her own merit and now through the undeniable truth of her heritage. However, life had more challenges in store for them. As Alexandra and Richard grew closer, the media caught wind of their extraordinary story. Reporters began camping outside both their homes, desperate for interviews and photos. One particular journalist, Dave Reynolds from the Daily Chronicle, seemed determined to dig up dirt. He published an article questioning Alexandra's identity and suggesting that Richard was being manipulated by a clever con artist. The article hit Richard hard. Not because he doubted Alexandra, their connection had been proven beyond any doubt, but because it forced him to confront how his past actions had led to this situation. "I should have been a better husband," he confessed to Alexandra one evening as they hid from the paparazzi in his penthouse. "A better father. If I hadn't been so blind back then, none of this would have happened." Alexandra took his hand. "Mom's diary showed me that you both made choices based on who you were then. What matters is who you are now." Their conversation was interrupted by Richard's assistant, rushing in with urgent news. Someone had leaked Grace's diary entries to the press. The most private thoughts of Alexandra's mother were being splashed across tabloid headlines. Alexandra felt violated. Those words had been her mother's private thoughts, never meant for public consumption. She spent the night reading through the online articles, tears streaming down her face as strangers picked apart her mother's pain for entertainment. Richard was furious. He set his legal team on finding the source of the leak while trying to protect Alexandra from the media circus. But Alexandra surprised him by suggesting a different approach. "Let's tell our story," she said. "The whole truth, on our terms. No more hiding, no more letting others control the narrative." Richard hesitated. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back." Alexandra nodded firmly. "Mom wrote in her diary that she left because she wanted me to know what real love looked like. Let's honor her by showing how two people can find their way back to each other and heal old wounds." They arranged an exclusive interview with a respected journalist known for her sensitivity and integrity. Together, they shared their story: the young workaholic father, the desperate mother, the lost years, and the miracle that brought them back together. Alexandra spoke about her experiences in foster care and homelessness, not to gain sympathy but to highlight the importance of kindness and perseverance. Richard openly acknowledged his past mistakes and shared how losing his family had changed him. The interview was raw, honest, and deeply moving. When it was published, the public response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from other separated families, from people who had found hope in their story of reconciliation. But the most unexpected response came from Thompson Industries itself. The employees who had once whispered about Alexandra now saw her in a new light. Her determination to succeed despite her circumstances, her choice to work her way up from the mailroom despite her father's position, it all spoke to her character. One morning, Alexandra arrived at work to find a card on her desk. Inside were dozens of signatures from her colleagues, along with a simple message. "We're sorry we doubted you. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." As she read the card, Alexandra felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent so many years feeling alone, and now she had not only found her father but also a community that accepted her for who she was. That evening, as she and Richard shared their usual dinner, she noticed something different about him. The haunted look that had lingered in his eyes since their reunion was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a peace she hadn't seen before. "You know," he said, "your mother once told me that the greatest act of love is being brave enough to start over. I didn't understand what she meant back then, but I do now." As autumn turned to winter, Alexandra found herself adapting to her new life while struggling with unexpected challenges. The media attention had finally begun to die down, but new complications arose from an unexpected source: Richard's extended family. The annual Thompson family Christmas gathering was approaching, and Richard's siblings and their children were all eager to meet the niece and cousin they never knew existed. Alexandra felt overwhelmed by the prospect of facing an entire family of strangers who shared her blood. "They're going to have expectations," she confided to Richard one evening as they walked through Central Park, their breaths visible in the cold air. "What if I'm not what they're hoping for?" Richard stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're more than I ever dared hope for," he said softly. "And if they can't see how extraordinary you are, that's their loss, not yours." The gathering was held at Richard's sister Catherine's sprawling estate in Connecticut. As their car pulled up to the mansion, Alexandra's stomach churned with anxiety. Richard squeezed her hand reassuringly before they stepped out into the snow. The reception was mixed. Catherine embraced Alexandra warmly, tears in her eyes as she noted how much her niece looked like Grace. Richard's younger brother Peter, however, kept his distance, watching Alexandra with barely concealed suspicion. During dinner, Peter couldn't contain himself any longer. "Isn't it convenient," he said loudly, "that you showed up right when Richard was considering stepping down as CEO?" The table fell silent. Alexandra's fork clattered against her plate, but before she could respond, Richard's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. "I've watched you in my position for years, Peter," he said calmly. "If anyone's motivation should be questioned, perhaps we should discuss your sudden interest in my retirement plans." Catherine tried to smooth things over, but the damage was done. Alexandra excused herself and fled to the garden, where the winter air helped cool her burning cheeks. She found herself at a small pond, now frozen over, reflecting the moonlight. "He was always the jealous one," a voice said behind her. Alexandra turned to find an elderly woman approaching with a cane. It was Richard's Aunt Rose, the family matriarch. "I knew your grandmother," Rose continued, settling onto a nearby bench. "She had the same fire in her eyes that I see in yours. And the same birthmark." She nodded toward Alexandra's wrist. You knew my grandmother?" Alexandra asked, sitting beside her. Rose spent the next hour sharing stories about the Thompson family history, the triumphs, the scandals, the reconciliations. "Every family has its Peters," she said wisely. "But we also have our Catherines, and our Richards, and now we have you." When they returned inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Rose's clear acceptance of Alexandra seemed to settle the matter for most of the family. Even Peter looked somewhat chastened after what Alexandra assumed was a stern talking to from his aunt. Back in the city, Alexandra threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She had been promoted to the marketing department, where her creative ideas and fresh perspective were earning her recognition on her own merit. One project particularly excited her, an initiative to help homeless youth find employment opportunities. She presented her proposal to the board of directors, drawing from her own experiences to illustrate the potential impact. "We have the resources to change lives," she concluded her presentation. "I know because this company changed mine, even before anyone knew who I was." The board approved her proposal unanimously. As she packed up her materials, one of the older board members approached her. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you remind me of your father when he was younger, before he lost his way. But you have something he didn't have then, wisdom that can only come from struggling." Richard, who had recused himself from the vote to avoid any appearance of favoritism, was waiting outside the boardroom. "How did it go?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. Alexandra's smile told him everything he needed to know. As they celebrated over lunch, she noticed him growing contemplative. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Richard took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "I've spent decades building this company, but lately I've been wondering about what really matters. Watching you today, seeing how you want to use our resources to help others, it reminded me of your mother." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a proposal to establish the Grace Walker Foundation, dedicated to helping homeless youth and separated families reunite. "I'd like you to run it," he said. "Not because you're my daughter, but because you understand both sides of the story. You know what it's like to need help, and now you know what it's like to be in a position to give it." Alexandra stared at the proposal, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom would have loved this," she whispered. "Yes, she would have," Richard agreed. "I've spent years trying to make up for my past mistakes. But maybe the best way to honor Grace's memory is to help prevent others from experiencing what our family went through." As they discussed the Foundation's possibilities, Alexandra realized how far they'd come. 6 months ago, she had been sleeping in doorways, and Richard had been a lonely man haunted by his past. Now, they were planning a future that could help countless others. That evening, as Alexandra walked through her apartment, no longer feeling like an imposter in her new life, she found herself talking to her mother's photo. "I understand now, Mom," she said softly. "Why you left, why you stayed away, and why you always told me that helping others was the most important thing we could do. Dad understands too, finally. And together, we're going to make sure your legacy lives on." She pulled out her mother's diary and added her own entry for the first time. "Dear Mom, today we started something amazing. Dad and I are building a foundation in your name. Remember how you always said that sometimes you have to fall apart to come back stronger? Our family did that. We fell apart, but now we're rebuilding something better, not just for ourselves, but for others who are lost and searching for their way home." Spring arrived in New York City, bringing with it new beginnings and unexpected challenges. The Grace Walker Foundation was taking shape, but its first major initiative had hit a significant roadblock. The City Council was hesitant to approve permits for the Foundation's proposed transitional housing project, citing concerns from wealthy neighbors about property values. Alexandra sat in her office, surrounded by architectural plans and community impact reports, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just another corporate project, it was personal. She knew exactly what it felt like to have nowhere to go. "We'll find another location," Richard suggested during their morning coffee meeting. But Alexandra shook her head, her mother's determination shining in her eyes. "This is the perfect spot," she insisted. "It's close to public transportation, walking distance to 3 different job training centers, and has enough space for both housing and educational facilities. We just need to make them understand." She spent the next week preparing for the City Council meeting, gathering statistics and testimonials. The night before her presentation, she visited her old spot near the coffee shop where she used to wash up. A young woman was huddled there now, clutching a backpack. Alexandra approached her carefully. Hi, I'm Alexandra. Would you like to get some coffee? It's warm inside. Over cups of hot coffee, Alexandra learned the woman's name was Joy, and her story was heartbreakingly familiar. Lost job, medical bills, no family to help. As they talked, Alexandra felt more certain than ever about the Foundation's mission. The next morning, at the city council meeting, Alexandra stood confidently at the podium. But instead of starting with statistics and projections, she began with a story. Last night, I met a young woman named Joy, she said, her voice clear and strong. She's sleeping in the same doorway where I spent countless nights just months ago. Before you make your decision today, I want you to know her story, and the stories of countless others like her who need more than just a helping hand. They need hope. She went on to share her own journey, not as the CEO's daughter, but as someone who had lived the reality of homelessness. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, council members began asking questions. Not about property values, but about how they could help. The permits were approved unanimously. As Alexandra and Richard celebrated that evening, she noticed him watching her with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking about how much you've grown," he said. "Not just in confidence, but in understanding how to use your voice for others. You're becoming a leader in your own right." Alexandra smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I wish Mom could see this," she said softly. "She can't," Richard replied, reaching into his briefcase. "Look what I found in storage." He pulled out an old VHS tape labeled Grace's Graduation. They spent the evening watching footage of Grace's nursing school graduation. Alexandra saw her mother as she'd never seen her before, young, vibrant, full of dreams about helping others. In one scene, Grace spoke directly to the camera about her hopes of opening a free clinic someday. "That's it," Alexandra whispered. "Dad, that's what we need to add to the housing project, a medical clinic. We can partner with nursing schools, offer residency programs. Mom's dream doesn't have to die with her." The idea took off. The Grace Walker Medical Clinic became a central part of the Foundation's plans, offering both healthcare services and training opportunities for nursing students from underprivileged backgrounds. As the project grew, Alexandra found herself dealing with an unexpected personal challenge. News outlets had begun calling her the Princess of Wall Street, focusing more on her rags to riches story than her actual work. The attention brought scrutiny to every aspect of her life, including her non-existent dating life. "You should get out more," Catherine urged during one of their now regular family dinners. "All work and no play isn't healthy." But Alexandra was hesitant. "How can I know if someone likes me for me, or for my new last name?" she asked. Richard understood her concerns all too well. "Your mother struggled with the same thing," he shared. "She never trusted people who were too impressed by our wealth. That's one of the things I loved about her, she could always see through pretense." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call. There had been a fire at one of the city's largest homeless shelters. Dozens of people were displaced, and more were arriving every hour as word spread that the shelter was closed. Alexandra and Richard sprang into action. Though their housing project wasn't finished, the Foundation had recently purchased a small hotel for future renovation. Within hours, they had arranged for temporary housing for all the displaced residents. As Alexandra helped people get settled, she found herself working alongside a young doctor who had volunteered to check on the residents. Dr. James Chen was quiet and efficient, more concerned with helping people than networking with the CEO's daughter. Over the next few weeks, as they worked together to ensure the displaced residents received proper care and support, Alexandra found herself drawn to his genuine compassion and dedication. He reminded her of her mother in many ways, always putting others first, finding practical solutions to help those in need. One evening, as they were reviewing medical supply needs for the temporary shelter, James looked up from his clipboard. "You know, when I first heard about the billionaire's daughter running a homeless foundation, I was skeptical," he admitted. "I thought it was just another rich person's vanity project. I'm glad I was wrong." Alexandra appreciated his honesty. What changed your mind? Watching you work, he said simply. You don't just write checks, you remember people's names, their stories. You understand their struggles because you've lived them. That's rare in this world. As spring turned to summer, the Foundation's first housing project neared completion. Alexandra stood with Richard at the construction site, watching workers install the sign for the Grace Walker Medical Clinic. Your mother once told me that true wealth isn't about what you have, Richard said, but about what you give. I didn't understand then. But watching you these past months, how you've used everything you've gained to help others, I finally get it. Alexandra leaned against her father's shoulder, thinking about how far they'd come. She had found not just her father, but her purpose. The pain of her past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something meaningful, a bridge to help others find their way home. The summer heat wave hit New York City hard, but inside the newly opened Grace Walker Center, hope bloomed like a garden in the desert. Alexandra stood in the lobby, watching as residents moved into their new apartments. Each family had their own story of struggle and survival, and she knew them all by heart. The medical clinic was already operating at full capacity, with Dr. James Chen serving as the chief resident physician. His dedication to the patients matched Alexandra's own passion for the project, and their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something deeper, though neither had put it into words yet. One particularly humid evening, as Alexandra was reviewing applications for the center's job training program, Richard appeared in her office doorway with an unusual expression. I need to show you something, he said, holding an old leather briefcase she'd never seen before. I've been waiting for the right moment, and after seeing everything you've accomplished here, I think it's time. Inside the briefcase were hundreds of letters, all written in her mother's handwriting, all addressed to Richard but never sent. They were dated from the years after Grace had left, continuing until just weeks before her death. Where did you find these? Alexandra whispered, touching the envelopes with trembling fingers. Your mother's old nursing colleague contacted me last week, Richard explained. She'd been holding on to them all these years. Grace had made her promise to keep them safe, but never specified what to do with them. Together, they began reading. The letters revealed a side of Grace that Alexandra had never known, a woman who still loved her husband deeply but couldn't reconcile that love with her fear for their daughter's emotional well-being. She wrote about Alexandra's first steps, first words, school achievements, and all the moments Richard had missed. I see you in the newspaper sometimes, one letter read, and I can tell you're changing. The man I see in those photos isn't the same workaholic who couldn't make time for his family. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake, if I should have given you another chance. But then I remember the loneliness in our house, and I stay strong for our daughter. As they read through the night, both father and daughter crying and laughing at Grace's detailed accounts of their lost years, Alexandra felt the final pieces of her family's puzzle falling into place. Her mother hadn't been running from love, she'd been running toward a different kind of love, one that put her child's emotional needs first. The next morning, despite having barely slept, Alexandra felt energized. She had a new mission. During the Foundation's board meeting, she proposed an additional wing for the Grace Walker Center, a family counseling center specializing in helping separated families reconcile. Sometimes people need more than just financial help to heal, she explained to the board. They need support in rebuilding relationships, in understanding each other's perspectives, in finding their way back to each other. The proposal was approved, but it came with unexpected complications. As Alexandra dove into the planning, she found herself working late hours, missing dinners with her father and canceling plans with James. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her dedication to helping other families reconnect, she was starting to mirror her father's old workaholic patterns. It was James who finally confronted her about it. He found her in her office at midnight, surrounded by blueprints and budget reports. You're turning into the person your mother was trying to protect you from becoming, he said quietly, placing a cup of tea on her desk. The words hit Alexandra like a physical blow. She looked around her office, really seeing it for the first time in weeks. The empty takeout containers, the wrinkled clothes she kept for emergencies, The missed calls from Richard on her phone. I just want to help as many people as possible, she said weakly. James pulled up a chair. I know. But you can't help others by burning yourself out. Your story inspired people because it was about more than just success. It was about healing, about finding balance, about remembering what really matters. That weekend, Alexandra took a step back. She spent Saturday with Richard, not discussing work but sharing more of Grace's letters and remembering the woman they'd both loved. On Sunday, she finally accepted James's invitation for a proper date, a simple walk through Central Park followed by hot dogs from a street vendor. You know, James said as they sat on a park bench, when I was in medical school, one of my professors said something I'll never forget: healing others starts with healing yourself. Alexandra thought about those words as she watched children playing nearby. Her own healing journey hadn't ended when she found her father or started the foundation. It was ongoing, requiring constant attention and care, just like any relationship. The following week, she made changes. She delegated more responsibilities, set boundaries on her working hours, and made sure to have dinner with Richard at least twice a week. She also started a support group at the center, where residents could share their own stories of family separation and reconciliation. The autumn leaves were turning golden when Alexandra received an unexpected visitor at the Grace Walker Center. A young woman clutching a worn backpack stood in her office doorway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. It was Joy, the woman she'd met outside the coffee shop months ago. I saw you on the news, Joy said softly. I couldn't believe it was the same person who bought me coffee that night. I've been wanting to come here, but I was scared. Alexandra immediately cleared her schedule. Over the next few hours, she learned that Joy had been sleeping in various shelters, trying to find work but struggling without a permanent address or support system. Her story could have been Alexandra's own, if fate hadn't intervened that winter morning. Would you like to be our first resident in the new wing? Alexandra asked. The Family Counseling Center was opening the following week, and several apartments had been set aside for emergency cases. Joy's eyes filled with tears. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Someone once helped me without knowing me, Alexandra replied, thinking of that snowy morning when she'd spotted Richard struggling on the street. Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. As she helped Joy settle into her new apartment, Alexandra felt a familiar presence behind her. James had finished his rounds at the clinic and was leaning against the doorframe, watching her with a warm smile. You know, he said as they walked back to her office, I fell in love with you because of moments like this. You never forgot where you came from. Alexandra stopped in her tracks. It was the first time either of them had used the word love. James seemed to realize it too, his ears turning slightly red. He stammered. Alexandra silenced him with a kiss, right there in the hallway. When they pulled apart, both were grinning like teenagers. The moment was interrupted by an urgent call from Richard. His voice was tense as he asked Alexandra to come to his office immediately. When she arrived, she found him staring out his window at the city skyline, holding what looked like more old letters. These just arrived, he said without turning around. They're from Grace's last week's. Her colleague found them in another box. His voice cracked slightly. She knew she was dying, Alexandra. She wanted to contact me, to tell me about you, but she was afraid it would only hurt you more if I hadn't changed. Alexandra moved to stand beside her father, taking his hand. Together, they read Grace's final letters. In them, she expressed her deepest regrets about keeping father and daughter apart, but also her hopes that someday they would find each other. I dream sometimes, one letter read, that you've become the man I always knew you could be, and that our daughter will discover the father I wish she'd known. I'm running out of time to make things right, but I pray the universe will find a way to bring you together. Richard wiped his eyes. She did bring us together, he said softly. That day on the street, that wasn't just chance. That was Grace, watching over both of us. The letters sparked a new initiative for the foundation. Alexandra proposed a program specifically focused on helping terminal patients reconcile with estranged family members. The Grace's Last Wishes program would provide counseling, travel assistance, and support to families seeking reunion before it was too late. As the program took shape, Alexandra found herself dealing with an unexpected personal challenge. The media had gotten wind of her relationship with James, and suddenly their private romance was fodder for public consumption. Gossip columns speculated about whether the homeless heiress was really in love or just seeking stability. The attention was hard on James, who valued his privacy and worried that his patients might be uncomfortable with their doctor being in the spotlight. But instead of pulling away, he surprised Alexandra by suggesting they use the publicity to their advantage. Together, they gave an interview focusing on the medical clinic's work and the importance of accessible healthcare. James spoke passionately about treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, and the article ended up bringing valuable attention to the Foundation's mission rather than their personal lives. 1 year to the day after Alexandra had first helped Richard on that snowy street, they held a gala celebrating the Grace Walker Center's achievements. Joy was there, now employed as the center's resident coordinator. Peter, Richard's once skeptical brother, had become one of the Foundation's most active board members after witnessing its impact. And James stood proudly by Alexandra's side as she addressed the crowd. "A year ago I was homeless," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I didn't know my father was alive, let alone that he was searching for me. I didn't know that one act of kindness would change not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of others." She gestured to the screens around the room, showing photos of the center's residents, the medical clinic's patients, and the families reunited through their programs. "My mother wrote in her last letters that she prayed for my father and me to find each other. But I believe she was praying for more than that. She was praying for healing, not just for our family, but for all families torn apart by circumstances, misunderstandings, and lost opportunities." Richard joined her on stage, and together they unveiled the latest addition to the Grace Walker Center, a memorial garden dedicated to Grace's memory. At its center stood a sculpture of two hands reaching for each other, nearly touching, with a quote from one of Grace's letters: "Love finds a way to bridge every distance." As the crowd moved to the garden for the dedication, James pulled Alexandra aside. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, surrounded by photos of lives changed and families reunited, he knelt down on one knee. "I was going to prepare a speech," he said, holding up a small velvet box. "But everything I want to say, you already know. You've taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about being there, day after day, helping each other grow and heal and become better people." Alexandra felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she nodded yes. Richard, watching from across the room, saw in that moment not just his daughter's joy, but a glimpse of Grace's smile, living on in their child's happiness. On a bright spring morning, 2 years after that fateful encounter on a snowy street, Alexandra stood in front of her mother's grave for the first time. She wasn't alone. Richard stood on one side, holding her hand, while James waited respectfully a few steps behind. They had finally located Grace's resting place in a small cemetery outside the city. The headstone was simple, reading only, "Grace Walker, beloved mother," with the dates of her birth and death. Alexandra knelt and placed a bouquet of white lilies, her mother's favorite flowers she'd learned from the letters, against the cool stone. "I think she knew," Alexandra said softly, "that everything would work out somehow. All those letters she wrote, she never stopped believing in love's power to heal." Richard squeezed her hand. "She was right about everything. About who I needed to become, about what really matters in life." He placed his own bouquet beside Alexandra's. "I wish I could tell her that." "I think she knows," Alexandra replied, touching the wedding invitation in her pocket. She and James had chosen this day to visit Grace's grave specifically. It was exactly 1 month before their wedding day. The Grace Walker Center had expanded beyond their wildest dreams over the past 2 years. What started as a single building had grown into a network of facilities across the city, each offering hope and second chances to those in need. The Grace's Last Wishes program had reunited hundreds of families, and their medical clinic model was being replicated in cities around the country. But perhaps the most meaningful change had happened within the Thompson family itself. Richard had gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations at Thompson Industries, focusing instead on mentoring Alexandra as she balanced her foundation work with learning the family business. Peter, once suspicious of his niece, had become one of her strongest advocates, using his business connections to support the foundation's initiatives. As they drove back to the city, Alexandra's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Joy. The center's newest resident, a young mother with 2 children, had just received news that her own mother was critically ill in Chicago. Within hours, the Grace's Last Wishes program had arranged travel and accommodation for the family reunion. "You know what this means," Joy texted later that evening. "We've now helped 1,000 families reconnect." 1,000! Alexandra shared the news with Richard over their weekly father-daughter dinner. His eyes misted over as he raised his glass in a toast. "To 1,000 more," he said. The wedding preparations were in full swing, but Alexandra had insisted on keeping things relatively simple. The ceremony would be held in the Grace Walker Center's Memorial Garden, with residents and staff invited alongside family and friends. Instead of wedding gifts, they asked for donations to establish a scholarship fund for homeless youth pursuing medical careers. 1 week before the wedding, Alexandra received a package from Richard's Aunt Rose. Inside was a delicate silver locket that had belonged to Alexandra's grandmother. But what brought tears to her eyes was the small note that fell out with it, a recipe card in her mother's handwriting, dated from before she left Richard. "Wedding cake recipe," it read. "For my daughter's special day." The discovery sparked a flurry of activity. With help from the center's culinary training program students, Alexandra and James decided to use Grace's recipe for their wedding cake. The simple gesture felt like a way of including her mother in the celebration. On the morning of the wedding, Alexandra stood in her office at the center, looking out over the garden where chairs were being arranged for the ceremony. The cherry trees they planted in Grace's memory were in full bloom, their pink petals drifting like snow, a reminder of that winter morning that had changed everything. A knock at the door revealed Richard, already emotional before the ceremony had even begun. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small box. Inside was a charm bracelet with 3 charms, a heart representing grace, a key representing hope, and a bridge representing reunion. "Your mother wore this bracelet until the day she left," Richard explained. "I found it in her jewelry box that morning. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on." As Alexandra fastened it around her wrist, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, Joy, now the center's associate director, looking elegant in her bridesmaid's dress. "It's time," she said with a warm smile. The ceremony was everything Alexandra had hoped for. James, handsome in his tuxedo, teared up as she walked down the aisle on Richard's arm. The garden was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the Grace Walker Center, residents past and present, staff members, families reunited through their programs. During the reception, Alexandra and James shared their first dance to the same song that had played at Grace and Richard's wedding. As they moved across the floor, Alexandra caught sight of her father watching them, joy and memory mingling in his eyes. Later, as guests enjoyed slices of wedding cake made from Grace's recipe, Richard clinked his glass for a toast. 2 years ago, he began, I was a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. I had success, wealth, power, but I had lost the only things that truly mattered: love, family, purpose. Through an act of kindness from a stranger who turned out to be my own daughter, I found not just what I had lost, but so much more. He turned to Alexandra and James. Today, we celebrate not just a wedding, but the power of love to heal, to transform, and to create ripples of hope that touch countless lives. Grace would be so proud of the family we've become, and the family we continue to build. As the evening drew to a close, Alexandra and James slipped away to the quiet of the memorial garden. The sculpture of reaching hands glowed softly in the twilight, and cherry blossoms continued to fall like gentle snow around them. "You know," James said, holding her close, "when people hear our story, they focus on the fairy tale aspect, the homeless girl who turned out to be a billionaire's daughter. But that's not what makes it special." Alexandra nodded, understanding. "What makes it special is what we've done with it, how we've turned our own healing into healing for others." As if to emphasize her words, they could hear laughter and music drifting from the reception, where their unique family, biological and chosen, residents and staff, those who had found hope and those who helped provide it, celebrated together. Grace's final letter had ended with words that now seemed prophetic. "Love has its own gravity. No matter how far apart people drift, love finds a way to pull them back together. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes chance encounters, but love always finds a way home." Standing in the garden her mother had inspired, surrounded by the legacy of healing and hope they had built together, Alexandra knew that Grace had been right all along. Love had found a way, not just for her and Richard, but for thousands of others who had discovered that it's never too late for a new beginning.